So imagine you drop a 50-pound cinder block directly onto your foot.
Oh man, ouch.
Right. But let's really look at what happens in the milliseconds that follow that impact. Because, I mean, from an engineering standpoint, it is an absolute masterclass in biomechanics.
It really is. You have the sheer kinetic energy of this massive concrete block meeting the incredibly fragile structural integrity of your metatarsals.
Exactly. Bone fractures, tissue is just completely crushed.
Yeah.
And instantly, nociceptors in your tissue detect this massive cellular damage, and they fire off electrical signals.
Yeah, these action potentials, they race up the C fibers in your leg, they hit the spinal cord, and then they surge straight into your brain.
Specifically lighting up the somatosensory cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex like a Christmas tree.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, an emergency room doctor can look at an X-ray to see the broken bone. A neuroscientist can look at an fMRI and see the exact regions of your brain metabolizing glucose as those signals arrive.
Which is to say, they can see the physical reality of the event. It is entirely measurable, it's observable, and it is completely objective.
Right, which paints this complete, unbroken chain of physical cause and effect. It's a closed loop of biology and physics. A mass accelerated by gravity deforms another mass, triggering an electrochemical cascade.
And if you were observing this event from the outside, like armed with perfect scientific instruments, you would have a totally exhaustive account of everything that just occurred.
But listen to what we are actually doing here. We are completely ignoring the most important, undeniable part of that entire event.
The pain.
Yes, the subjective, invisible, horrifying sensation of agony. The actual feeling of the pain. I mean, the doctor cannot see the pain on the X-ray.
And the neuroscientist can't point to a splash of color on an fMRI scan and say, ah, yes, there is the subjective experience of suffering. They just see sodium and potassium ions trading places across a cellular membrane.
Right, and that means we are looking at a foundational landscape that is incredibly murky. Because the objective physical machinery and the subjective private experience, well, they seem to exist in two entirely different universes.
It is the absolute core of philosophical muddy waters. We call it the mind-body problem. We have the damaged physical toe, and we have the electrical signals cascading through the nervous system, but nowhere in that kinematic description of physical matter do we find the feeling of the pain itself.
It's like the sensation is completely alien to the physical properties of the system producing it. And navigating that exact gap is why we are here today.
So true.
For those jumping in, this audio overview is the second part of a larger 4-part series of YouTube clips we're exploring on philosophy. And this series has multiple episodes each, really mapping out the vast landscape of human thought.
But before we can dive into the messy history of political theory, or debate specific ethical frameworks, or unravel existentialism in the coming parts, we have to establish the foundation.
Exactly. We're looking at the core tools and the absolute rules of reality.
Yeah.
These concepts form the baseline for everything else. I mean, you cannot debate the ethics of artificial intelligence or the moral responsibilities of a human being if you haven't yet defined what a human being actually is at a fundamental level.
Defining that baseline really dictates the entire architecture of how you view the universe.
So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the ultimate dividing line in human thought. Mind versus matter. Are you just a biological meat machine? Are you an immaterial ghost driving a meat machine? Or is the meat an illusion entirely?
To map this out, we are pulling from a massive stack of source materials today. We have entries from comprehensive encyclopedias of philosophy, dense academic articles dissecting physicalism and panpsychism, and some really extensive transcripts from modern thinkers.
Like Dr. Nathan Hawkins and the philosopher John Wilkins. We are going to explore 3 massive world-defining paradigms today: dualism, materialism, and idealism. And then we'll plunge into the strange, modern middle paths that attempt to reconcile all the seemingly irreconcilable stuff.
And the historical arc of these paradigms reveals just how desperate human beings are to solve this puzzle. The sheer intellectual gymnastics required to defend any of these positions shows that every single option comes with a really heavy conceptual cost.
Well, let's start with the paradigm that carries the lowest conceptual cost for our everyday intuition. Let's go back to the stubbed toe or the crushed foot. The feeling that you are an inner observer, right? A private self, looking out through the windows of your eyes, piloting a physical body.
Yeah, that intuition, the idea that there is a physical world and a separate mental world, leads us directly to our first paradigm, substance dualism.
Right. And substance dualism basically argues that reality is fundamentally built out of 2 entirely distinct kinds of stuff.
Exactly. And to understand how deeply this is woven into human history, We can look all the way back to ancient Greece. In Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, we find one of the earliest really rigorous defenses of this split.
Plato viewed the mind, or the soul, as something entirely distinct from the body. In fact, he kind of viewed the body as a temporary prison for the soul, right?
He did. But Plato wasn't just relying on this poetic feeling of being trapped in meat. He actually attempted to build a logical framework to prove this separation. He used what he called the argument from opposites.
Break that down for us. What is the argument from opposites?
Well, it relies on a specific observation of the natural world. Plato noted that things seem to generate from their opposites. So a thing becomes larger only by first having been smaller. A thing becomes colder only by first having been warmer.
Okay, I track that.
So he extended this logic to states of being. He said waking comes from sleeping, and sleeping comes from waking. Therefore, the non-material soul, which represents life, must come from its opposite.
The material body, which is subject to death.
Exactly. It's a cyclical view of existence where the immaterial and material are constantly trading places, but they remain fundamentally distinct.
I mean, looking at that from a modern perspective, the biological logic feels incredibly shaky. Generating life from death isn't exactly how cellular mitosis works.
Oh no, it's definitely pre-scientific.
But he didn't stop there. He layered this with the argument from affinity, which I think is much closer to what we think of as classical dualism.
Right. The argument from affinity attempts to categorize the universe into two distinct realms. Plato aligned the soul with the invisible, the divine, and the immortal realm. He called that the realm of the form.
The body.
The body aligns with the visible, the mortal, and the composite realm of physical objects. His crucial point here was about divisibility. The physical body is a composite. It is made of flesh, bone, and blood.
And because it is made of parts, it can decompose. It can be broken down.
Precisely. The soul, however, belongs to the realm of the simple and indivisible. You cannot cut a soul in half. And because it cannot be broken into pieces, it is immortal.
That idea that the mind is an indivisible unity is a really powerful concept, and it gets aggressively supercharged thousands of years later. Plato sets the stage in antiquity, but the thinker who truly codified this framework for the modern world was René Descartes.
Yes, in his 1641 Meditations on First Philosophy.
Yeah, Descartes famously divides all of reality into two totally distinct, mutually exclusive categories of substance, res cogitans and res extensa.
Res cogitans translates literally to thinking substance. This is the mind. Its defining characteristic is that it thinks, but crucially, it is entirely unextended.
Meaning it takes up absolutely zero physical space.
Exactly. No length, no width, no depth. Whereas res extensa is extended substance. This is matter, the physical body, the brain, the cinder block we talked about.
It takes up space in 3 dimensions. It has physical coordinates, but it possesses zero capacity for thought or sensation.
None whatsoever. And Descartes reaches this conclusion through his legendary argument from indubitability. He basically runs a thought experiment of radical skepticism.
Right. He says, I can doubt everything. I can doubt that my body is real. I can doubt that the physical world around me exists. I could be dreaming, or an evil demon could be deceiving my senses.
Which ultimately leads to his foundational bedrock, I think, therefore I am. The one thing he realizes he absolutely cannot doubt is the very fact that he is doubting.
Because the act of doubting requires a doubter.
Exactly. The subjective experience of thinking is self-verifying.
Let's unpack this using a more modern lens, because I feel like the evil demon concept can feel a bit archaic to some people.
Sure.
Think about being strapped into a highly advanced virtual reality rig. It is a perfect simulation.
Yeah.
You are walking through a digital forest fighting dragons. Now, you can radically doubt that the dragons are real.
Obvious.
You can doubt the forest. You can even reach a point of philosophical paranoia where you doubt that the physical VR headset strapped to your face is real. Maybe you are just a brain in a vat being stimulated by a supercomputer.
Or maybe you're hallucinating the entire concept of technology.
Exactly. You can doubt the existence of every single physical object. But the one thing you absolutely cannot doubt is that you are experiencing something.
All right.
The raw, undeniable fact of the experience itself remains, even if the content of the experience is totally fabricated.
That analogy captures the core of Descartes' epistemic gap beautifully, because you can doubt the res extensa, the extended physical world, including the physical brain itself. But you cannot doubt the res cogitans, the thinking, experiencing mind.
And so, if you can doubt the existence of object A, but you cannot doubt the existence of object B, then object A and object B cannot be the same thing. Therefore, the mind and the body are distinct substances.
Descartes is really relying heavily on the properties of these two things to prove they are separate. Which brings us to the real philosophical armor protecting dualism in our sources.
Oh, you mean Leibniz's law?
Yes, Leibniz's law, or the indiscernibility of identicals. It is the absolute cornerstone of this debate. It states a very simple, rigorous rule. If two things are truly identical, if entity A is exactly the same thing as entity B, then they must share all of the exact same properties at the exact same time.
Every single one.
Every single one.
Yeah.
If you can find even one solitary property that A possesses that B does not possess, then they are not identical. They are two different things.
Okay, let's apply Leibniz's law to the mind and the brain. The physical brain is an organ. It sits inside your skull. It weighs about 3 pounds. It has a specific biochemical temperature.
It has a spatial location. I can point to exactly where your temporal lobe is. It is made of lipids, water, and proteins. Those are its physical properties.
Right. Contrast that with the properties of the mind. The mind possesses qualities that seem entirely alien to the physical universe. Consider the concept of intentionality.
And in philosophy, just to clarify, intentionality doesn't mean doing something on purpose. It means aboutness. Your thoughts have the property of being about something.
Yeah, you can have a thought about the Eiffel Tower, or a thought about the concept of justice, or a thought about a unicorn, but a physical object cannot be about something.
No, a cluster of neurons firing in your prefrontal cortex isn't about the Eiffel Tower, any more than a puddle of water is about a rain cloud. It is just a complex chemical reaction happening in physical space. A chemical reaction just is.
And beyond intentionality, there is the property of absolute privacy. Only you have direct, unmediated access to your conscious thoughts. A neuroscientist could crack open your skull, map every single synaptic connection, and measure every electrical impulse with perfect precision.
But they will never be able to observe your subjective experience of the color red or the specific nostalgic ache you feel when you hear a certain song. Physical objects are publicly observable. Mental states are inherently private.
And as the sources point out, mental states, like beliefs, have truth values. A belief can be objectively true or false. I can believe the earth is flat, and that belief possesses the property of being false.
But a physical brain state, an electrical discharge across a synapse, it can't be true or false. It's like asking if a rock is true or false.
Right.
The question doesn't even make categorical sense.
So applying Leibniz's law, the conclusion seems inescapable for the dualist. The mind has intentionality, absolute privacy, and truth values. The brain has mass, temperature, and spatial coordinates. They share almost no properties whatsoever.
Therefore, the mind and the brain cannot possibly be the same thing. Substance dualism survives because our lived experience deeply validates this division.
It survives, but it isn't monolithic. The sources outline a few nuanced variations that try to soften the blow of having two entirely different substances running the universe.
Yeah, like property dualism, which feels like a bit of a compromise.
Right. Property dualism attempts to merge the two substances back into one. It argues that there is only one fundamental substance in the universe, and that is physical matter.
However, when physical matter becomes organized in incredibly complex ways, like the human nervous system, it generates non-physical properties.
So under this view, the mind isn't a separate free-floating ghost. It is an irreducible non-physical property that emerges from the physical brain.
Much like how wetness is a property that emerges from a complex arrangement of hydrogen and oxygen molecules, even though a single hydrogen atom isn't wet.
Then you have predicate dualism, which steps away from the physics entirely and focuses on linguistics. It argues that the vocabulary we use to describe the mind, words like belief, desire, fear, nostalgia.
What philosophers call folk psychology.
Right. Folk psychology.
Yeah.
Predicate dualism says that vocabulary cannot ever be translated into the vocabulary of physics.
Yeah. The argument here is that you simply cannot describe a feeling of existential dread using only the language of quantum mechanics or molecular biology. The two vocabularies describe fundamentally different aspects of reality, and one cannot be reduced to the other.
But whether you are a substance dualist, a property dualist, or a predicate dualist, you eventually slam into a massive, glaring problem, the fatal flaw that threatens to bring the entire dualist architecture crashing down.
Oh yes, the problem of interactionism. This is the immovable object in the path of dualism. If the mind is an immaterial, unextended ghost that takes up absolutely zero physical space, and the body is a physical machine governed by the laws of physics, how on earth do they communicate?
Exactly. If I have an immaterial desire to drink coffee, How does that ghost-like desire actually cause my physical arm to reach for the mug?
This devastating critique was leveled at Descartes almost immediately. In 1643, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia wrote an incredibly sharp letter to Descartes outlining this exact physical impossibility.
What did she say?
She pointed out that in the physical universe, for an object A to cause an object B to move, there requires spatial contact. You have to push something. There must be an impulse, a transfer of kinetic energy through surface-to-surface interaction.
The cue ball has to physically strike the 8-ball.
Exactly. So Princess Elizabeth forces Descartes into a corner. If the mind has no physical surface, no spatial extension, and no mass, it possesses no kinetic energy. How can something with zero kinetic energy push a physical button in the brain to cause a cascade of physical movement in the body?
Because it violates the fundamental conservation of energy.
Mm.
If the mind moves a physical atom in the brain, it is injecting new energy into a closed physical system out of nowhere. It is literal magic.
Descartes' response to her was notoriously weak, by the way. He hypothesized that the interaction happened in a tiny structure in the center of the brain called the pineal gland.
The pineal gland.
Yeah, he thought the mind somehow wiggled the pineal gland, which then directed these animal spirits through the nerves to move the muscles. But pointing to where the magic happens doesn't explain how the magic happens. He never resolved how the immaterial actually grips and manipulates the material.
And the interaction problem is so severe, so physically impossible, that some philosophers decided to keep the dualism but abandon the interaction entirely. They resorted to a desperate and frankly terrifying fix called epiphenomenalism.
Yeah, we read about Frank Jackson's defense of epiphenomenalism in the sources. It is a bleak perspective. Epiphenomenalism argues that the physical brain does cause the mental mind to exist. The material creates the immaterial.
Okay,
But the causal arrow only goes one way. The mind is completely, utterly powerless. It cannot cause anything to happen in the physical body. Mental states are just passive byproducts of physical brain activity.
The analogy often used is the exhaust coming out of a car engine. The engine produces the exhaust, but the exhaust does absolutely nothing to drive the car forward. The exhaust can't turn the steering wheel. So under this view, my subjective feeling of wanting coffee, the conscious desire that I experience, that feeling didn't actually cause me to walk to the kitchen.
According to epiphenomenalism, no. Your physical brain, operating purely on biological algorithms, calculated a deficit in hydration and caffeine, and it initiated the complex sequence of muscle movements required to walk to the kitchen and brew coffee.
So what was the feeling of wanting it?
The subjective feeling of wanting the coffee was just a movie playing in your mind, generated by the brain after the fact, totally disconnected from the actual steering wheel of your body. You are a helpless passenger trapped in a biological automaton, hallucinating that you are the one driving.
Wow. That is deeply counterintuitive and honestly profoundly depressing. If epiphenomenalism is the cost of keeping the immaterial mind around, it feels like an intellectual dead end.
It's definitely a hard pill to swallow.
I mean, why would evolutionary biology even bother generating this incredibly complex, energy-intensive phenomenon called consciousness if it doesn't actually do anything to help the organism survive? It makes no sense.
It really doesn't. And this agonizing friction is exactly why philosophers started looking for an exit strategy. If the ghost in the machine creates this unsolvable interaction headache, maybe the simplest solution is to just evict the ghost entirely.
Which leads us out of the realm of dualism
Yeah.
and directly into the paradigm of materialism and its modern, highly sophisticated evolution, physicalism. Because if the interaction between two substances is impossible, the logical leap is to declare that there's only one substance.
Everything is just stuff.
Materialism is one of the oldest theories on the board. Going all the way back to ancient Greece, right alongside Plato's dualism, you have thinkers like Democritus. Democritus looked at the complexity of the world and stripped it down to its absolute bare minimum. He declared, all is atoms in the void.
Yeah, for classical materialists like Democritus, if something was real, it had to be a tangible, hard physical thing that bumped into other hard physical things. It had to possess geometric volume.
And this classical materialism survived for centuries, right?
It did. It fueled the 17th century mechanists like Thomas Hobbes, who viewed the entire universe, including the human brain, as a vast, complex clockwork mechanism. It was also the foundational bedrock for 19th century Marxist thought. The absolute, non-negotiable requirement for classical materialism was that everything real had to take up space. It had to exist in the X, Y, and Z dimensions.
But then the script gets completely flipped. Not by philosophers sitting in armchairs, but by scientists working in laboratories. Modern physics, specifically moving into the 19th and 20th centuries, completely shattered the classical definition of matter.
The transformation of this paradigm is detailed perfectly in our sources by a transcript from the philosopher John Wilkins. He explains that as physics advanced, scientists began discovering phenomena that were undeniably real, incredibly powerful, and capable of causing massive physical effects.
But they weren't matter.
Exactly. They were absolutely not matter in the classical, space-taking, hard billiard ball sense.
Wilkins points to the discoveries of Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, electromagnetic fields, photons, energy states, and later, quantum wave functions and singularities.
Think about a magnetic field. It is an undeniably real physical phenomenon. It exerts force. It can move a massive piece of iron. But a magnetic field doesn't behave like solid matter. It doesn't have a hard boundary. It doesn't take up traditional space in the way a cinder block does.
So the philosophical community realized they had a massive terminology problem on their hands. The word materialism was suddenly obsolete because the hardest of the hard sciences, physics, had moved beyond just matter.
They needed a new framework that could encompass electromagnetic fields, quantum probability waves, and whatever else physics might discover in the future.
And this shift catalyzed in the 1930s with thinkers from the Vienna Circle, specifically Otto Neurath and Rudolf Carnap. They abandoned the word materialism and championed a new, much broader term, physicalism.
Physicalism is a brilliant methodological pivot. It is the claim that everything that exists, every phenomenon in the universe, can ultimately be described by the language of an ideal completed physics.
Even if our current physics is incomplete.
Right. Physicalism assumes that whatever the final perfect physics looks like, it will be able to account for everything.
Wilkins makes an incredibly clarifying point about this flexibility. He argues that if tomorrow a portal opened and we suddenly discovered that a realm of angels actually existed, or if telekinesis was proven to be demonstrably real in a laboratory, the physicalists wouldn't surrender. They wouldn't suddenly become dualists.
No, the physicalists would simply assume that angels and telekinesis operate according to a specific set of physical rules, perhaps relying on undiscovered quantum fields or exotic energies. They would assume that a future updated physics would eventually be able to map, quantify, and describe the magic.
Under physicalism, there's no such thing as the supernatural. There's only physics we understand and physics we haven't discovered yet.
Which means, applying this to our mission today, there is no separate mental realm. The mind is not a ghost. The mind is simply the aggregate behavior of a highly complex physical biological system, the brain.
And this incredibly elegant solution neatly evaporates the interaction problem that destroyed dualism. If the mind is entirely physical and the body is entirely physical, there is absolutely no mystery about how they interact.
It is just physical forces acting on physical forces, neurons firing across synapses, the conservation of energy is preserved.
It is incredibly elegant on paper. It makes the math work. But we are right back to the cinder block on the foot. I understand that the brain is physical. I understand the nociceptors and the C fibers. But how does physicalism explain the actual subjective agony? How does a physical state generate a private feeling?
Yeah, this is the hard problem of consciousness, and it is where physicalism runs into its own massive, perhaps insurmountable, hurdle. The physicalist desperately wants to reduce the mind to physics, just as we reduced heat to mean kinetic energy, or water to H2O. But the subjective feel of an experience stubbornly refuses to be reduced to an equation.
Because if you map every single atom in my brain while I'm looking at a sunset, you still haven't captured the beauty of the sunset. You've just captured a map of atoms.
Exactly the problem.
Yeah.
And because this gap between the physical map and the subjective territory seems unbridgeable, some philosophers decide to take physicalism to its absolute, extreme, unflinching, logical conclusion.
They realize they can't reduce it, so they resort to eliminative materialism.
Right. Thinkers like Paul and Patricia Churchland propose a radical, scorched earth solution. If a mental state cannot be neatly reduced to the language of physics and neuroscience, then that mental state simply does not exist.
It feels like a magic trick.
Oh,
We can't explain the mind, so we're just going to declare the mind an illusion.
The Churchlands argue that our entire everyday vocabulary about the mind, all that folk psychology we mentioned earlier, concepts like beliefs, desires, intentions, they say it's actually a false, primitive, pre-scientific theory of how humans operate.
A false theory. What do they mean by that? How can my belief that it's going to rain be a false theory?
Consider the history of science. Hundreds of years ago, the greatest chemists in the world believed that combustion was caused by an invisible, mysterious substance called phlogiston that was hidden inside wood. When you burn the wood, the phlogiston was released into the air. That was their theory of fire.
And then later, modern chemistry discovered the element of oxygen and the process of oxidation.
Right, and they didn't map phlogiston onto oxygen. They didn't say, oh, phlogiston is just another word for oxygen.
Yeah.
They completely eliminated the concept of phlogiston from the scientific vocabulary. They realized it was a hallucination of a bad scientific model.
Okay, I follow the history. So how does that apply to the mind?
The churchlings are arguing that our concepts of beliefs, desires, and fears are the modern-day equivalents of phlogiston. They hypothesize that as neuroscience matures to an absolute level of perfection, we won't find specific, localized brain states that correspond perfectly to a vague concept like a belief that it will rain.
So the whole concept of a belief is just a clumsy, unscientific way of describing complex neural kinematics.
Exactly. Eventually, they argue, we will stop talking about beliefs and desires entirely. We will just describe the specific firing patterns of our neural networks. My C fibers are firing instead of I am in pain.
Let's stop right there. Denying that a vague, abstract concept like a belief exists as a concrete physical object is one thing. I can entertain that. But eliminative materialism doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't.
Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Georges Ray take this eliminativism to the level of qualia, the raw, subjective feel of experiences. They argue that our subjective sensation of pain, or our internal experience of seeing the color red, are essentially user interface illusions. They argue the feeling isn't real.
It is a staggering claim. Dennett's illusionism suggests that we are basically tricked by our own biological programming into thinking there is a private theater of experience in our heads, when in reality, there is only information processing.
I found a quote in the source materials from a Reddit thread on Rask philosophy discussing this exact eliminativist tactic. And it perfectly encapsulates the sheer incredulity most people feel when they hear this. A frustrated user asks, is there an established name for this kind of argument tactic, where the claim is so plainly absurd that even bothering to rebut it feels like a waste of time?
That frustration is completely justified. It feels like an intellectual shell game.
It is worse than a shell game. Telling me that my subjective sensation of pain does not exist or is an illusion, while I am actively screaming on the floor with a crushed foot, feels deeply, profoundly absurd. Descartes started this entire mess by pointing out that the one thing you absolutely cannot doubt is that you are experiencing something. And eliminative materialism looks at that bedrock fact and demands that we doubt the existence of the experience itself. It demands that we deny our own reality for the sake of keeping a scientific model clean.
It highlights the agonizing difficulty of the mind-body problem. Dualism gives you a ghost that violates the laws of physics and can't interact with the world. Physicalism asks you to either perform a miracle and explain how subjective consciousness emerges from dead, unthinking matter, or in the case of eliminativism, to look at your own joy, pain, and love and declare them non-existent illusions.
But listen to what we are actually doing here. We are so desperate to hold on to the reality of physical matter, the absolute supremacy of the physical atoms, that we are willing to eliminate our own conscious experience to make the math work.
It's wild when you put it like that.
If the physical model forces us to deny the one undeniable fact of our existence, maybe we have the entire hierarchy upside down. What if the matter is the illusion, and the mind is the only actual foundation?
Welcome to the radical, mind-bending world of idealism.
Let's talk about the bishop. George Berkeley, an incredibly influential 18th century Anglo-Irish philosopher. He looked at the chaotic mess of dualism. He looked at the cold, mechanical deadness of materialism, and he said, let's flip the script entirely.
He proposed a framework known as subjective idealism, or immaterialism.
Berkeley's entire philosophy rests on a foundational premise captured in a famous Latin phrase, esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived, or to exist is to be perceived.
To exist is to be perceived, meaning if something isn't actively being looked at, felt, heard, or experienced by a conscious mind, it literally ceases to exist.
Yes. Berkeley's argument is rooted in strict empiricism. He argues that all human beings ever actually have access to are the ideas, sensations, and perceptions occurring within our own minds. When you hold an apple, you do not have access to some independent, invisible, physical appleness.
You only have access to your mind's perception of its redness, the sensation of its smooth skin against your fingers, the perception of its sweetness on your tongue.
And those are all mental events. Redness is a mental event. Sweetness is a mental event.
Exactly. Since every single quality we attribute to the apple is a mental perception, Berkeley argues that we have absolutely no logical or empirical justification for assuming that a hidden, mind-independent physical matter exists behind those perceptions. The apple is nothing but a collection of ideas in a mind.
Berkeley was so confident in this that he issued a challenge, what philosophers call his master argument. He challenged anyone to try to conceive of an object that exists entirely unperceived by any mind.
Okay, I'll take the challenge. I am picturing a massive oak tree deep in the Amazon rainforest, completely isolated. No human has ever seen it. No animal is looking at it. It is entirely unperceived.
But listen to what you just said. You are picturing it,
Ugh.
and doing so you are perceiving it in your mind's eye. You are conceiving of it. Berkeley points out that you cannot conceive of an unconceived object because the very act of trying to do so requires you to conceive of it.
Right, the moment you try to imagine matter existing without a mind, you are using a mind to hold it in existence.
Therefore, he concludes, it is a logical contradiction. It is impossible for an object to exist outside of a perceiving mind.
You know, Berkeley's universe sounds exactly like the mechanics of a massive multiplayer online role-playing game, an MMO.
How do you mean? Let's thread that analogy out.
Think about a massive digital world like World of Warcraft. The digital forests, the mountains, the castles, they don't actually exist in the computer's memory as fully rendered 3D objects all the time. That would require an impossible amount of processing power.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Instead, the game engine only renders the graphics that a player's camera is currently looking at. If you turn your character around, the highly detailed forest behind you literally ceases to exist visually. It despawns and becomes background code, pure potential, until you look back at it and force the engine to render it again.
That is an extraordinarily apt way to visualize subjective idealism. For Berkeley, the physical world is essentially just a continuous rendering process happening within the consciousness of the observer. Matter is just the user interface of the mind.
But this leads to a terrifying level of instability. If I put a block of cheese in my refrigerator and close the solid door, I am no longer perceiving the cheese. Does the cheese literally despawn? Does it vanish from reality until I open the door again?
This is exactly where Berkeley's critics attacked him, and it's where he had to introduce a massive cosmic workaround to keep the universe stable. He argues that the cheese does not vanish, and the physical world remains consistent, because there is a single, eternal, infinite mind that is always perceiving everything, everywhere, all at once.
And that ultimate, untiring observer is God.
Yes, God's infinite perception is what holds the physical universe in existence. To use your analogy, God is the ultimate master server hosting the MMO, ensuring the geometry of the universe doesn't collapse into nothingness just because a human player logged off or closed the refrigerator door.
So Berkeley builds a reality made entirely of mind. Now, his version is considered ontological idealism. He is making a hard claim about what actually exists in reality, which is only minds and ideas. But our sources, specifically the transcript from Dr. Nathan Hawkins, warn us to carefully distinguish this from a different flavor, epistemological idealism.
Right, and the poster child for epistemological idealism is the towering German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant read Berkeley and thought the ontological idealism was taking things a step too far into mysticism. Kant wanted to preserve a stable physical world, but he fundamentally agreed that our minds are heavily involved in constructing reality.
Kant developed what he called transcendental idealism, and this is a massive shift. Kant argued that we absolutely cannot know what the world is like in itself, what he called the noumenal world.
The noumena is the mind-independent reality, the actual stuff out there in the dark. Kant argued that we are forever cut off from it. All we ever have access to is the world as it appears to us, filtered and processed through the hardwired structures of our own human minds.
And this filtered reality is what he called the phenomenal world.
Let's look at the mechanics of those filters. Kant is saying that things like space, time, and causality, the basic rules of physics, aren't actually properties of the universe itself. They are just the software programs our brains use to organize raw sensory data.
It's like we are born wearing permanent, rose-tinted virtual reality goggles that we can never ever take off. We can see a spatial, temporal world through the goggles, but we can never know if the real world outside the goggles actually has space or time.
Hawkins emphasizes that this makes Kant an epistemological idealist. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Kant is establishing the absolute limits of human knowledge. He isn't saying the physical world doesn't exist. He is saying our knowledge is entirely restricted to our mental representations of that world. The mind constructs the experience of reality, even if it doesn't construct the underlying matter.
Kant sets this very strict boundary. But as soon as he dies, a wave of philosophers takes his idea and just runs absolutely wild with it, smashing right through his boundaries. Thinkers like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Yeah, Hegel looked at Kant's hidden, unknowable, noumenal world, the thing in itself, and decided it was a useless concept. If we can't know it and we can't interact with it, why assume it's there at all?
Hegel developed absolute idealism. He argued that reality isn't just filtered by the mind. Reality is a massive, collective, absolute mind.
It's an incredibly grand, sweeping vision. For Hegel, everything that happens in human history, the evolution of art, the bloody wars, the advancement of science, all of it is just the absolute mind going through a dialectical process of coming to know itself. We are basically the universe's way of thinking about itself.
And then, reacting to the extreme rationality of Hegel, you have Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer took Kant's hidden reality and went in a completely different, much darker direction.
The ultimate pessimist.
Yes. He argued that the foundational ultimate reality hidden behind our perceptions isn't a rational thinking mind at all. Instead, it is a blind, ceaseless, irrational driving force that he called the will.
This explains why Schopenhauer is famous for being so dark. If the ultimate foundation of all reality is just a blind, unthinking urge to strive and consume, then biological life is fundamentally characterized by frustration, endless dissatisfaction, and suffering. We are just manifestations of this hungry will.
Idealism, in all these varied forms, dominated European philosophy through the 18th and 19th centuries. It was the intellectual heavyweight champion.
But what about today? I mean, in an era of quantum computing, neuroscience, and deep space telescopes, is anyone still seriously defending idealism in the 21st century? It feels like a relic.
You might be surprised. It has seen a significant, highly sophisticated modern resurgence. We can trace the roots of this revival back to the late 19th century American pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce developed a deeply weird and wonderful framework called objective idealism.
Peirce has one of the most poetic descriptions of physical matter in the entire philosophical canon. He described matter as effete congealed mind.
It is a stunning image. Peirce hypothesized that at the very beginning of the universe, there were no strict physical laws. There was only a state of maximum spontaneous freedom, pure mental potential.
And over vast stretches of time, through a process governed by absolute spontaneous chance, a doctrine he called psychism, this universal mind began to form habits.
Just like a human forms a habit by repeating an action until it becomes automatic and thoughtless.
Exactly. And Peirce argued that the rigid, unbreakable laws of physics we observe today, like gravity, electromagnetism, are simply incredibly old, deeply entrenched habits of the universal mind. Physical matter is just mind that has become so habituated, so predictable, that it has congealed or frozen into solid patterns. The physical universe is just a fossilized mind.
Bringing this right to the bleeding edge of contemporary thought, our sources highlight a framework called analytic idealism, heavily championed by the modern philosopher and computer scientist Bernardo Kastrup.
Kastrup is doing fascinating work by trying to marry the insights of idealism with the rigorous data of modern neuroscience and quantum mechanics. He argues that reality is, at its absolute base, constituted by a single, universal, spatially unbound field of consciousness.
But wait, if there is only one universal mind, why do I feel like I am a separate, private individual? Why can't I read your thoughts?
That is the obvious hurdle, and Kastrup uses a powerful concept from clinical psychology to explain it: dissociation.
Like dissociative identity disorder in humans.
Precisely. In clinical psychology, a patient experiencing severe trauma can undergo a process where their single, unified mind fractures into multiple, distinct, seemingly independent personalities, often called alters.
And these alters can have completely different memories, different visual acuities, and critically, they can be entirely unaware of each other's inner thoughts, even though they exist within the same foundational mind.
So Kastrup takes that psychological phenomenon and applies it to the entire cosmos. He argues that individual conscious entities, you, me, a dog, a whale, are essentially dissociated alters within the single universal mind. The dissociation boundary creates the illusion of a private, isolated self.
And what does that dissociation boundary look like from the outside? It looks like a physical body and a physical brain. The physical world we observe is simply what the universal mind looks like when viewed across a dissociative boundary.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. It solves the privacy problem while keeping the entire universe mental. Okay, let's take a step back and look at the vast map we have just traversed, because we are heading into our final paradigm and we need to understand the gridlock we are in.
We definitely need a recap.
We started with dualism, which matches our intuition, but is mathematically and physically ruined by the interaction problem. Then we swung to physicalism, which makes the science clean but fundamentally struggles to explain or brutally denies the undeniable reality of our subjective conscious experience. Then we explored idealism, which centers the mind beautifully, but asks us to believe that the physical universe is basically a cosmic hallucination, or a matrix-like projection, which deeply offends our common sense.
Every extreme position requires you to swallow a massive, seemingly impossible pill.
So the million-dollar question, is there a way to bridge the gap? Are there frameworks that refuse the extremes and try to build a foundation that accommodates both the physical brain and the conscious experience without denying either?
There are, and these middle ways are currently dominating the cutting edge of the philosophy of mind. The first approach is to find a bedrock foundation that is neither strictly mind nor strictly matter. This is known as neutral monism.
Neutral monism. This was a framework developed by heavyweights like Ernst Mach, William James, and Bertrand Russell.
The core thesis of neutral monism is that the fundamental building blocks of reality, the ultimate stuff out of which everything is constructed, are entirely neutral. These foundational elements do not possess intrinsic physical properties like mass, and they do not possess intrinsic mental properties like intentionality. They are just raw, neutral events or elements.
So if the bedrock of reality isn't mental and isn't physical, how do we get minds and physical bodies out of it? It sounds like trying to build a house out of nothing.
The secret lies entirely in the relationships. Ernst Mach described the foundational world as a vast, viscous mass of these neutral elements. Whether something manifests as mind or matter depends entirely on how these elements are grouped, structured, and related to one another.
Let's ground this with an analogy. Think about a standard deck of 52 playing cards. If you take a single isolated card, say the Seven of Hearts, that card is fundamentally neutral regarding any specific game. The card itself is not inherently a poker hand and is not inherently a solitaire sequence.
It's just a neutral entity with a pattern on it.
Right. But if you group that Seven of Hearts with 4 other specific cards based on the rules of poker, suddenly that neutral card becomes part of a flush. It takes on the properties of a poker hand.
And if you take that exact same Seven of Hearts and group it in a descending, alternating color pattern on a table, it becomes part of a solitaire game.
Exactly. The foundational element, the card, never changed its intrinsic nature. What changed was the context, the functional relationship to the elements around it.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. Neutral monism argues that if you group the neutral elements of reality together according to the causal laws of physics, how things push and pull in space, we label that grouping a physical object. If you take those exact same neutral elements and group them according to the laws of psychology, association, and memory, we label that grouping a mind.
Mind and matter are just 2 different ways of organizing the exact same neutral stuff.
It is an incredibly elegant workaround. Another middle way that attempts a similar synthesis, but from a much older tradition, is hylomorphism.
Hylomorphism has ancient roots, stretching back to Aristotle and heavily developed by Thomas Aquinas. But it is seeing a vigorous modern revival through thinkers like Andrew M. Bailey.
Hylomorphism essentially argues that you cannot separate the structure from the substance. It posits that physical objects are not just piles of dead matter. Every object is an inextricable combination of 2 things. Matter, which is the raw, unformed potential stuff, and form, which is the organizing principle, the structure, the specific way that matter is arranged.
The classic analogy here is a bronze statue. The matter is the raw bronze metal. The form is the shape of the statue, say, a statue of a horse. You can theoretically distinguish the concept of the bronze from the concept of the horse shape, but in reality they are absolutely inseparable. You cannot scrape the statueness off the bronze, and you cannot have a bronze statue without the bronze. If you melt it down, you destroy the form to get the raw matter back.
Applying this to the mind-body problem, hylomorphism argues that the mind is not a separate ghost floating around inside the machine. Instead, the mind is the substantial form of a biological living system. It is the incredibly complex organizing principle that makes the raw physical matter of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen function as a living, breathing, unified human being. The mind is the statueness of the biological body.
So it rejects dualism by saying the mind and body aren't 2 different things bumping into each other, but it rejects physicalism by insisting that the organizing form, the mind, is just as fundamental and real as the matter itself.
Exactly. But perhaps the most explosive, controversial, and rapidly growing middle way currently shaking up the philosophy of mind is the rise of panpsychism.
Panpsychism. The prefix pan meaning all, and psyche meaning mind. It is the view that mentality is fundamental and ubiquitous throughout the entire natural world. It means that mind is literally everywhere, baked into the very foundational fabric of the universe, alongside gravity and electromagnetism.
It sounds like mystical New Age thinking at first glance, but the modern defense of panpsychism is actually rooted in a highly rigorous critique of hard physics, heavily inspired by Bertrand Russell. This defense is known as the intrinsic nature argument, or Russellian monism.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this argument carefully, because when you truly grasp it, it completely shifts how you view the physical world.
Physics is undeniably the most successful predictive tool humanity has ever created. It can land a rover on Mars and predict the behavior of subatomic particles. But if you look closely at the actual equations and vocabulary of physics, it has a massive blind spot. Physics only tells us what matter does.
It provides a schedule of behavior.
Precisely. It describes matter's relational and dispositional behavior. It tells us how mass curves space-time. It tells us how a negatively charged electron repels another negatively charged electron. It provides a flawless mathematical map of relationships, causal push and pull, and external interactions.
But, and this is the absolute crux of the argument, physics tells us absolutely nothing about what matter is intrinsically in and of itself when it isn't interacting with anything else. It gives us the mathematical equation, but it doesn't tell us what underlying substance is actually running the equation.
We're left entirely in the dark about the intrinsic categorical inner nature of a physical particle. An electron is just a placeholder in an equation. However, the panpsychist points out that there is exactly one specific arrangement of physical matter in the entire universe where we actually have direct, inside, unmediated access to its intrinsic nature.
Our own physical brains.
Yes. The brain is made of physical matter, quarks, electrons, carbon atoms. And what is the intrinsic inner nature of the matter inside our skulls? It possesses consciousness. It possesses subjective experience.
So the panpsychist lays out the logic. The only intrinsic nature of matter we have ever encountered is consciousness. Physics is entirely silent on the intrinsic nature of all the rest of the matter in the universe. Therefore, the most elegant, logically consistent assumption, rather than inventing a secondary magical dead substance, is to assume that the intrinsic nature of all fundamental physical matter involves some form of consciousness.
Okay, let's test the limits of this. What does this actually mean in practice? Does an individual quark feel existential dread about the heat death of the universe? Is an electron sitting in a wire hoping it gets a promotion to a higher energy state?
This is where we must make a crucial, rigorous distinction to avoid sounding absurd. We have to separate pancognitivism from panexperientialism. Pancognitivism is the idea that fundamental particles have complex thoughts, beliefs, or cognitive processing. Almost no serious philosopher believes this. An electron does not have a midlife crisis because an electron does not have a prefrontal cortex to process complex linguistic thoughts.
Instead, contemporary philosophers endorse panexperientialism.
Yes. Panexperientialism posits that fundamental particles possess an incredibly basic, raw, primitive level of subjective experience. There's something it is like to be an electron, but that experience is unimaginably simple. It might just be a rudimentary, microscopic thrum of existence, a baseline vibration of being, completely devoid of thought, memory, or complex emotion.
And as we move deeper into the weeds, some thinkers take a step back even from that primitive experience, moving into panpsychism.
Panpsychism argues that individual fundamental particles don't actually have consciousness or experience themselves, but they possess proto-phenomenal properties. These are specific, unexperienced physical precursors to consciousness. When these proto-conscious particles combine and form the incredibly complex architecture of a biological brain, these precursors finally ignite into full-blown macroscopic subjective experience.
A specific flavor of this is panqualityism, championed by philosophers like Sam Coleman. Panqualityism suggests that particles possess unexperienced qualities.
Think of it like raw data waiting for a processor. The universe is filled with the raw, unattached qualitative data of redness or warmth or sharpness. These qualities just exist, floating in the fundamental structure of reality, but they aren't actually experienced until a complex biological system acts as a receiver, minding them together into a conscious moment.
It is an incredibly elegant way to integrate the mind back into the natural physical world without resorting to the spooky ghosts of dualism or the soul-crushing denial of eliminative materialism. But panpsychism is not a perfect silver bullet. It faces its own absolute, terrifying final boss.
The combination problem. This is the hurdle that keeps panpsychists awake at night.
Let's map out the combination problem. If panpsychism is true, then every individual electron, quark, and atom in my physical brain possesses its own tiny, discrete microconsciousness. But when I look introspectively at my own mind, I don't feel like a committee of 100 billions screaming atoms. I feel like one single, unified, coherent consciousness. I am a me.
The question is, how on earth do billions of distinct, microscopic conscious entities suddenly fuse their boundaries together to form a single, unified, macroscopic conscious mind?
We read about the psychologist William James outlining this exact impossibility way back in 1890. He called it the 101st feeling argument.
James was vicious in his critique of this fusion. He argued that if you take 100 individual distinct feelings or microminds and you pack them incredibly close together in a physical space like a brain, they don't logically combine. They remain 100 separate, windowless, isolated feelings.
Think of 100 distinct drops of oil floating in water. You can push them close together, but without a specific chemical mechanism to break their surface tension, they don't just magically become one giant unified drop of oil. They remain separate spheres.
Exactly. This is formally known as the subject summing problem. James argued that if a new, unified, overarching consciousness emerges that encompasses and experiences all 100 micro-feelings simultaneously, that macro-consciousness is a totally new, distinct fact in the universe. It is a 101st feeling. You cannot logically sum subjective experiences together like you sum physical mass. 2 half-pounds of lead make a pound of lead. But 2 half-consciousnesses don't make a whole consciousness, they just make 2 half-consciousnesses sitting next to each other.
The combination problem is so severe that it threatens to sink bottom-up panpsychism entirely. If you can't explain how the microscopic builds the macroscopic, the theory stalls. So how do modern panpsychists attempt to solve this?
They execute a brilliant conceptual inversion. If combining microscopic minds into a macroscopic mind is logically impossible, then perhaps we have the direction of reality backward. This leads to a mind-bending variation called cosmopsychism.
Cosmopsychism, the idea that the cosmos itself is the fundamental mind.
This framework relies heavily on Jonathan Schaeffer's metaphysical concept of priority monism. For centuries, science has operated on smallism, the assumption that the smallest microscopic parts, quarks, atoms, are the fundamental reality, and everything bigger, trees, humans, planets, is just built up from them.
Priority monism flips the arrow of reality completely upside down. It argues that the whole is prior to its parts.
Under priority monism, there is only one single, truly fundamental, indivisible thing in existence, the entire universe as an integrated whole. The parts, the galaxies, the planets, the individual atoms are just derived, dependent fragments of that ultimate unity.
And when you apply that to consciousness, you get cosmopsychism. It argues that the entire universe is conscious. It is one single, unified cosmic mind.
And look at how elegantly this solves the combination problem. It avoids it entirely. You no longer have to explain the impossible miracle of how billions of tiny micro-conscious particles fuse together to make you.
Because I was never built from the bottom up.
Exactly. Instead, you explain how the single unified cosmic consciousness fragments, decombines, or dissociates, echoing Castrup's idealism, to create localized, derived, individual human minds. Under cosmopsychism, you and I are not built out of smaller conscious bricks. We are localized, temporary whirlpools, forming in the single unified cosmic ocean of consciousness.
That is a staggering place to land. Let's take a breath and look back at the immense territory we have covered today. We started with the intuitive split of Plato's soul imprisoned in the body and Descartes' ghost in the machine.
We watched the interaction problem destroy that framework, leading to the rise of materialism and physicalism, which eventually demanded that we eliminate our own subjective experience entirely.
We flipped the universe inside out with Berkeley rendering reality like an MMO server, and Kant locking us behind the goggles of our own perceptions.
And finally, we waded into the middle ways, searching for synthesis through neutral monism, the intrinsic nature of panpsychism, and the vast ocean of cosmopsychism.
It is a dizzying array of intellectual architecture. But what is vital to recognize is that every single one of these paradigms is a rigorous, desperate attempt by brilliant minds to solve the exact same undeniable everyday mystery. What happens when you drop a cinder block on your foot?
And I want to connect all of this abstract theory directly back to you, the listener. Because this is not just abstract dorm room philosophy designed to sound smart at parties. This is the absolute foundational baseline for everything else we are going to explore in the rest of this series. How you answer this ultimate question, what the universe is made of, and what you are made of, changes absolutely everything about how you live your life.
It dictates your entire worldview. Consider the implications of just one choice. If you genuinely believe you are purely a biological algorithm governed entirely by the deterministic laws of physics under strict physicalism, then your approach to free will, to criminal justice, to personal responsibility, and to your own inevitable mortality looks radically different than if you believe you possess a divine, immaterial, immortal soul.
And if you believe, through panpsychism or cosmopsychism, that you are an integral conscious fragment of a living, experiencing universe, your relationship to the natural environment, your empathy toward other living creatures, and your understanding of your own grief, joy, and isolation changes fundamentally. You are not a stranger wandering through a dead mechanical universe. You are the universe experiencing itself.
The baseline you adopt creates the parameters for your ethics, your politics, and your psychology.
Navigating these muddy waters is the only way forward to build a coherent worldview. And before we let you go, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought experiment to mull over on your own, drawing on the intersection of the philosophy of mind and the hyper-accelerated pace of modern technology.
Consider the devices surrounding you right now. If strictly reductive physicalism is true, and the human mind is nothing more than incredibly complex physical information processing, then an artificial intelligence built from silicon and neural networks is just another complex arrangement of matter. Given enough time and architectural complexity, that silicon will inevitably generate or simulate real, identical consciousness. It is just a matter of engineering.
But if panpsychism is true, the implications become incredibly strange. If every fundamental particle in the universe possesses a raw, intrinsic sliver of proto-consciousness, does the specific, highly complex architectural combination of silicon, copper, and electricity inside a supercomputer actually generate a unified, subjective experience right now?
Look at the laptop on your desk or the smartphone in your hand that you were using to listen to this deep dive. It is processing massive amounts of integrated information. If panpsychism is correct, could that device already possess a tiny, raw, rudimentary sliver of proto-consciousness?
Is the device in your hand experiencing the raw, primitive thrum of something right now? It makes you look at the cold, physical objects around you a little differently, doesn't it? Thank you so much for taking this plunge into the absolute foundation of reality with us. The diagnostic X-ray machine might be broken when it comes to measuring the mind, but exploring these questions is the only way to truly understand what we are. Join us next time as we take this newly established baseline and apply it in the next installment of our series. Until then, keep questioning the reality right in front of you.